President Trump's escalating threats against Iran, including his infamous threat to end Iran's civilization, has sparked a backlash among some of the biggest stars in MAGA world.
Now it's time to say no, absolutely not, and say it directly to the president, no.
The president, 380, yes, shut up. Shut up about that. You don't threaten to wipe out an entire civilization.
He's out of control, and people within the administration need to step up, take responsibility, and rein this in. It's insanity. It's calling for the murder of an entire civilization of men, women, children, of innocent civilians.
How do we 25th Amendment his ass?
Well, unsurprisingly, Trump did not take too kindly to those remarks. He lashed out at right-wing media figures Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, Candace Owens, and Alex Jones over their criticisms of the war. Trump said they have, quote, low IQs and are, quote, stupid people. Tucker Carlson responded to Trump's attacks, telling Newsmax, quote, I've always liked Trump and still feel sorry for him as I do all slaves. He's hemmed in by other forces. He can't make his own decisions. It is awful to watch. Carlson also trolled Trump by selling merchandise on his site referencing Trump's low IQ attacks. I think what's interesting here is that there are a lot of people out there who somehow convinced themselves that Donald Trump was going to be more dovish than Kamala Harris. And they should maybe engage in some self-reflection on those predictions, those prognostications, because the only way you could believe that things would have ended up worse under Harris than under Trump as regards to our, military adventurism around the world is if you had, ignored every single thing Donald Trump said or did in the last decade. But that's just my opinion.
Well, I will say this, though. He did say he was not going to start any new war, so he did lie to the people. So I think the question is whether or not people believed him. And I think...
But he said everything about everything.
Correct.
Right? So it's like, why did they choose that thing to believe?
It really was the central tenet of 2015 propelling his candidacy through the Republican primary. It was this, and then it was trade. And that's why I do think that this fight is significant for the slight attrition. I don't think we're all the way there yet in a full-scale Republican revolt over the war. We have the Pew poll that we can flash and talk about. What I found interesting was that Republican voters in this recent Pew poll, over all of the 12 foreign policy areas that were surveyed were above 60%. And actually, Iran wasn't even the worst issue. The worst issue was actually Ukraine and Russia and then NATO. And overall, while it has dropped from earlier years, still there's a relative amount of confidence. And it's really among the younger Republican voters who are showing disapproval.
And that's the area of risk. It's young men who he depended on, who a lot of people believe pushed him over the edge in certain states. And it's also the sort of maybe center-right folks, independents and moderate conservatives who, bought into or believed a lot of that or were particularly interested in some of the economic messaging of this administration and maybe just didn't think so deeply about some of the other messaging or how that messaging would torpedo his economic messaging, frankly, because we're, of course, seeing how all these things are interconnected. We're living it at our gas pumps every single day. But it's that exact group that I think a lot of these folks are now speaking to. And that's where his vulnerability is. I thought it was interesting that the president also called these folks out by name, but he hasn't gone after the Theo Vaughns, Andrew Scholes, these guys who have been criticizing him heavily, but still have a ton of credibility with this younger group. I mean, that his own son, Barron, represents. And I know that Barron listens to some of this stuff. And so I just found it interesting who he's willing to go full attack on and those who he seems to be taking a little bit more of a wait and see approach with. Some of it may be that in the case of Megyn Kelly, in the same week that she said what we just saw her say there, criticizing the president, she also said that she basically would never, ever vote for a Democrat and she would vote for a Republican even if they used a nuclear weapon. And so, to be honest with you, if you say things like that, then the candidates have no need to follow through on any of the promises they make to you because they know you're just going to be a chump and vote for them anyway. So it's kind of that mindset. If I'm Trump, I'm listening to people like that say that, and I'm I can reel you back in whenever I want.
But Tucker, he knows he can't will back in.
Yeah.
He hasn't been able to. And Tucker has been standing
with Joe
really
Rogan,
firm. But Joe Rogan isn't really MAGA right. He was a convert. The difference between a Theo Vaughn and a Joe Rogan, who are, they converted, so to speak, and they were part of the male wave, the younger wave, but then they're not permanent, sticking with him forever. Right. And so in this midterm election, you can't lose those right-leaning independents and those younger men.
So the point that I want to make, though, about you were talking about, like, young men who thought that he was going to deliver on all of these promises. I think we should have a different standard for, like, random voters, marginal voters who are not so engaged with politics, right? Who it's not their job to follow the news. It's not their job to pay attention to policy positions. They're just trying to put food on the table. I get it. But if you are Megyn Kelly, if you are Tucker Carlson, if you are any of these people whose job it is to be a professional pundit and you didn't see a version of this coming, I'm sorry, I do not feel bad for you. Like, no, the wool was not pulled over your eyes. This was fairly obvious.
I go back to the point, which is, and I'm genuinely trying to understand this, is it that they believe Donald Trump or that he showed them something that should have made them not believe Donald Trump? It's a slight nuance, but like Donald Trump said, not starting any new wars. We've spent a lot of wars. I don't want to go to any more wars. So even if you looked at Donald Trump for the past 9 years before that moment and said, I now believe Donald Trump because I don't want to start new wars, he lied to you. And I think that's where they are coming from. They feel betrayed that he lied to them about this issue. I think your point is valid, which is anybody who's been following Donald Trump could have at least said he lies about everything. Yes. So this is not going to be new. He's saying this, and I remember this because a lot of people, a lot of Muslim Americans in Michigan wanted Donald Trump just because they did not like Kamala Harris and the positions the Biden administration took about Gaza. Donald Trump found a handful of Muslim leaders, took them on stage in Michigan, and got them to stand on stage with him as he promised no new wars. And a lot of Muslim Americans fell for that. Now, that doesn't mean that they bought into everything Donald Trump said, but on that one issue, they were willing to go along with it simply because of the fact that he offered them that lie. And, that's the hard part in this, is like they feel that he was lied to just as many as Megyn Kelly and Tucker Carlson and perhaps others. But I think anyone who follows Donald Trump knows that he's been lying since he came down the staircase.
It does remind me, though, of 2016, the blow-up vote, where the whole people who didn't want to vote for Hillary, and they were like, we'll just take the chance, we'll go with Trump. Right. And then so tired of the Kamala Harris-Biden status quo that those Muslim American voters were willing to risk it and vote for Trump, who had been promising no wars and didn't start a war his first term.
Last thing I'll say is just that I think the other question under this whole umbrella is whether you believe what they're even saying now is a deeply held and real conviction. I think perhaps for Marjorie Taylor Greene, who gave up her job, who was certainly very fearful about what was going to happen to her kids and threats to her family. But I think there's a real open question if anything Megyn Kelly is saying on her show about any of this right now is a deeply held conviction or a reaction to something she's just seeing in her audience, or the way that she thinks the wind is blowing. I don't know.